So in this session, we are going to look at barriers in development communication and overview. Largely gives you an introductory idea about what are the barriers. Lastly, I'm looking at what kind of communication issues occur in the context of development. And then in the subsequent sessions, we are going to look at what they are and individually and how they impact the process of development. The past decades have manifested not only a new paradigm for development, but also increasing concern about the role that communication technology plays in modern societies. So most of us are part of modern societies. We are moved from largely an agrarian society to a technocratic society. In between, there is the process of industrialization that happened, which led to opening various avenues in development, in the context of development. So much has been written and said about communication and development. In spite of a number of reported success, criticisms has been made in the past for overlooking communication as an important factor in development programs and for inefficient use of communication strategies, media, messages, and models. In the last lecture, we looked at role of development in communication and how communication can play a very significant role in initiating different kind of development programs. We looked at in the context of India, using several instances and case studies, and how individual medium, whether it is the newspapers or radio or television, what role they have played in taking different kind of developmental messages forward. Although the failure of developmental programs cannot be blamed solely on communication factors, the role of communication and development cannot be disregarded. We can't throw the role of communication and development completely off and say that, okay, X development program failed because of strategic issues or not having proper interventions in the right direction. Discussion of communication problems naturally raises the question of communication's role in development. So if there are communication issues that occur in the context of development, then the very existence of its role in that sector would be questioned or would be discussed or debated. And this has been a subject of debate among many scholars in the recent years. And that's how several policies have undergone sea change, and there are several new strategies that has come up using communication as a tool, or how communication tools could be integrated for different kind of developmental programs. Past experiences show that there were at least 2 or 3 major approaches to the role of communication in development, something that we have discussed over the semester right in the beginning. Our early lectures were based on how approaches to development communication could be looked at as from what point of view perspective we can look at the various approaches, and those were theoretical in nature, something that we discussed right in the beginning of the semester. The development planners were mainly concerned with economic development. If you look at Rostow's model, which we discussed elaborately in the past, we would look at how economic development models were largely a matter of concern when development strategies or development planners were laying out their plans. On the other hand, those who treated communication as the major key to development seem to have learned that this premise was wrong as the previous one. Okay, the modernization paradigm or the development paradigm in the context of only focusing on implementing economic policies were not that effective. And this is something that those people who were communication theorists or sociologists who brought in communication as a tool for examination realized that earlier models that were pushed, keeping the national developmental agenda in mind, would not work. The sole emphasis on mass media in modernizing the developing world gradually changed from a two-step flow of information through opinion leaders to a multi-step flow. Now, two-step flow of information is something that you would have studied in, the first semester itself when we discussed about the various communication models. We did kind of brought in this kind of a conversation saying that how two-step flow works, and how opinion leaders play a very significant role in shaping a public opinion. Now that has changed over a period of time. When we look at uh, modernizing developing societies, or um, looking at the development of society from a modernization point of view, the two-step flow of only the opinion leaders playing a significant role had changed to a multi-step flow, where there are other players and there are other, strategic interventions that were needed in the post-independence era largely. The preconceived notion about the effects of mass media and development were later proven to be unrealistic. It would be largely considered to be unrealistic or proven to be unrealistic, largely because understand that media is it's a ever-changing dynamic space. So if we just restrict it to one particular medium, or if we are not futuristic in nature and see what kind of a impact it would have, or what kind of an effect it would have in the overall development, or in the overall holistic development of a particular geography or a space, then we are being myopic in our notions, and those sort of things, those sort of ideas will later proven to be uh, not working or unrealistic in nature. Elaborating further, the major focus of the old or dominant paradigm of communication was based on the diffusion of innovation and dissemination of new ideas and technologies through the mass media, or mediating opinion leaders and change agents in order to motivate third world masses to development. So there is an existing model or models of development or communication, and those were brought in without considering or without keeping in mind what are the challenges or what are the basic issues that are required in a developing country or an underdeveloped country when we are keeping their development in mind. So it would be like bringing in another shoes, not taking a measurement of your own foot. So it would either be short or long, and it would not fit in. So this totally did not work. The whole diffusion of innovation model, which worked, which was brought in, or the modernization paradigm that was brought in the context of looking at how development messages could be disseminated with new ideas or new technologies, didn't fit in because there are several barriers that would come up, which would create a hindrance between communicating, bringing communication between those people who are the primary consumers, or who are the ones who are at the bottom end of development as against the top end. So the top ends are always going to get benefited, or because they have the technical know-how, they have knowledge, they are more privileged, understand that they're culturally more open. So in the society, which is divided into so many stratas, cutting across religion, cutting across caste, cutting across economic class. So this sort of segregation, because of the existence of this kind of segregations, there are several barriers that existed, and um, the those people who had access, they would always be in an authoritative state. So what happened is the Western societies, or the so-called developed societies of that time, they offered theories and models and propositions and practical guidelines to development, which had got no significant social connection, so to say, with us. Us means I'm looking at it from a point of view of third world. Uh, us would represent us and all those third world nations which are struggling with any kind of developmental implementation or agendas. So for the third world masses to accept development, as not just as a paradigm, but as as a functional tool, or as a evolving process, that did not happen despite the intervention of new ideas and technologies, because the diffusion of innovation project, or the modernization project that was proposed in the 1960s and 70s by the Western theorists or Western developmental sociologists or strategists completely fall flat. Diffusion is usually seen as God-sent autonomous process, which assures the trickling down of income and welfare generating ideas, and which thereby guarantees the distribution among all members of population. Now, why would it not work? Try and look at it from a point of view as to if the whole idea is to spread message, and once you pass it on, it must trickle down, and people must accept those ideas and buy those ideas. And because those models are successful and they have pronounced it self, pronounced themselves in the context of economic growth, then why would it not work in our context? Or why those ideas which were earlier considered to be welfare generating in the context of West, why would it not guarantee any kind of distribution within the members of a certain population, let's say our country for that matter? It would not work, though it was considered. This is where the problem was, because it was considered that it would automatically happen. It did not automatically happen. That's why, after 70 odd years of independence, we are still struggling with basic ideas of sustenance. We are still facing challenges regarding poverty, migration, healthcare sector, technological access, education. So all the challenges that are there in the context of development still remain the same. To a very minimum extent, it has possibly reached a certain stage, but after that, nothing much has happened. And this process is extremely slow because it's a huge population, and majority of the population, if they are below poverty line, they would have they wouldn't have access to things beyond just trying to manage the basic amenities of life. So when we look at food, clothes, shelter, the next thing that would possibly come up is education and healthcare. These are the major 5 pillars. Now, unless the first 3 things are addressed, unless people can battle poverty out, unless people have enough, clothes to wear, so to say, or houses to stay, which are safe, then it would not happen. People, their primary focus would be the surviving. So unless we look at beyond survival strategies, then the other thing would come up. Then the avenues of development would not be looked at just from a point of view of diffusion and accepted that, okay, this trickling down method of giving 5 successful economic strategies wouldn't be seen the same way. So the Western model would not fit in. It took nearly a decade or so for this erroneous assessment of the role of mass media to be further realized, along with the wrong implications of the dominant paradigm of development. That's why in the 80s, things did slowly started changing, because the insiders, those people who are part of the think tank within a particular country, they started rejecting those sort of models, saying that no, it would not work for us because we have a different population to deal with, and our challenges are radically different. Our barriers are different than that of the first world. Rogers, as one of the major contributors to the dominant paradigm, has himself realized the need for a new approach to communication and development. So when we talk about the context of development, we cannot try to just look at it unidimensionally and say that, okay, this is what we have proposed as a dominant paradigm and it has worked in the West, so it must work in other countries which are in a state of developing their spaces, or which are still struggling with underdevelopment. They accept the same processes and apply it. It didn't work. Communication theory from the early simple source to receiver one-way model gradually developed into a dynamic process model by taking interactive social systems into account. Okay, so what does it mean in the context of development? It means that if it is just a one-track thing, there are only senders who have these intended messages which would be sent to the receivers, and there is no feedback that is looked at. There is no assessment of that communication channel or process of feedback being looked at. It would not work. So when there is this sort of a gradual process that has happened over a period of time to a space where largely integrative social systems are considered for any kind of development process, then now is the time when we look at those structures or systems. And you, for that matter, uh, are born into a generation of interactive social systems. You know, the very fact that you guys are using different kind of social media apps in order to interact and engage with people. And because of access to technology, you can interact with anybody in the world practically. Whosoever would be your receiver if you intend to send any kind of message. So along with this evolution of accepted ideas about development and social change, attention further shifts from mere persuasion and transmission of information to the receiver and his needs and involvement. Okay, so for the first time, the receivers or the consumers are no more passive in nature. They're not mere consumers. They're not just there to sit and accept any model of persuasion that is being pushed forward to them. So it is equally important kind of take their involvement into account or take their needs and requirements into account. That is the reason why in the past those models failed or those methods or those processes failed because it was extremely top down in nature. People from the West would come in, they would examine your space and they would suggest models, and government in its 5-year plan would integrate those sort of plans and programs and models and frame them as policies and pass it on to people, and people would not be in a position to accept or buy into that idea or implement it because it was not practically possible, because their needs and their involvement in how they can um, evolve or grow in that stage never considered at the first place. That led to a huge crisis or a problem. So the old concept of empathy, co-orientation, and participation seem to have moved to the forefront. And these are, like, for example, empathy, co-orientation, and participation. If you look at it, the entire communication system or structure over a period of time has evolved because of this. People were empathetic towards each other in a certain community or in a society. That's why they were so close-knit. The whole concept of close-knitness um, is not was not taken into consideration. It's like, okay, individually or as a community, are you just heading towards development mindlessly? No, it won't work that way. Unless people feel for each other, if I don't feel for a certain community, I might not be able to help them at the first place because I would never consider what are their needs. I'm just passing on what I have to pass on. So unless those questions were asked, unless you spend considerable amount of time with the communities or individuals and try to sort of build an empathetic relationship with them or co-orient them, the whole process of orienting, trying to tell them and trying to show them how they can benefit from the kind of developmental processes that are laid down. So many times they will not be on the same page with you because they have not um, got access to education the way you are. So your privilege should be used in order to add value to their lives instead of you coming from an authoritative space and trying to provide information claiming that this is accurate and this is applicable. And if you are trying to derive success out of those, then you have to buy into that idea. No, that won't work. What would work rather is how do you co-drive them or orient them into the process or structure by showing them things, by making certain projects on an experimental basis or on a pilot basis work so that they can see for themselves what they can, what works for them or what doesn't. So in the process, you would also learn, as a development um, strategist or a theorist or somebody who is coming from a different space, an urban space for that matter, somebody who has gone abroad to study the process of development, is going to come back and try to reorient. So for us, there is a lot of unlearning that needs to happen culturally, socially, We need to be more empathetic towards them, and then bring in participation of the people. Any development project to take off successfully and to be able to be in a state of sustainability, involvement and participation of the ground workers or the primary consumers or those people who are at the bottom rung end of the society is extremely crucial. So DEFCON would only work if people participate. If there is a lack of participation, that issue needs to be addressed first, than throwing more and more number of policies from the establishment and saying that, okay, we have done our job, then now it's up to you to accept. No, it won't work that way. So given this state of affairs, how would one determine the role of communication and development programs? How do we place communication as not just as a medium, but as a functional unit in across development programs that is being planned out both by the dispensations, whoever is ruling the country, or by the NGOs or those people who are involved in that process. Then what conditions are to be met for success? What are the pre-existing situations? What are the conditions that are necessary in order to make that communication process successful whenever we talk about implementing developmental plans? As observed, communication can lead to success if it is receiver-centric, or it is bottoms-up or participatory in the context of development. So participatory approach would be when you involve the primary players, the primary stakeholders. Who are the primary stakeholders? You and me are the primary stakeholders? No, we are somebody who are facilitating the processes. Where are we facilitating these processes? We are facilitating that within the urban poor, within the migrant communities, within villages, within extreme poverty zones. So these are the places and the geographies and the communities whom we need to address. So how do we bring in different participatory approaches which would work? How would we make a communication message or a communication model bottom up? What would be bottom up in the context? Bottom up means things coming from them, not just from us. So you need to increasingly have more and more conversations with them, spend more time with them, so that you can actually understand and then empathize. You need to understand first to what is the rationale that they are putting it, why they are saying that X kind of agriculture works in this space than some other space, because they bring in the traditional knowledge, they bring in knowledge which is indigenous in nature over a period of time, and because of the intervention of technology, the society has become technocratic. But if you look at our histories, culturally we had been an agrarian society. So we have survived because of agriculture. So all of a sudden, somebody who was, engaged in farming for 5 generations, 10 generations, you are trying to tell them, no, now this machine is going to work and it is going to yield better. So they won't just readily buy into that system. Whether a machine is required for every kind of farming, if you are pursuing similar kind of strategies, it won't work. For which you need to have a bottom-up approach, for which you need to reach out to more number of people and actually strike dialogues and conversations with them and ensure that they understand what you are trying to offer to them. And if needed, you need to show how this works. That's why those pilot projects are very important. Then it has to be receiver-centered. Okay. In order to adopt development, you have to make the development strategies and plans and actions receiver-centric. Same thing. Receivers are those people, the primary stakeholders I was talking about. This partly is a question of reappraising the major features of old communication models. So include those old communication models, whatever you have studied and discussed and implemented in the past, whether it is the first world or the third world nations, and then see whether they can be really applied when we look at the current developmental position of a particular country or a particular community. If any communication is to succeed, the communication messages must meet the needs of the receiver. Okay, that's why constantly that word is coming up, the need of the receiver. What is the need of the receiver? Unless we try to devise communication strategies which takes care of the need of the receiver, it won't be successful. Then it would be a top-down approach, which has failed in the past. We have seen that. Although looking at the communication process, we cannot completely detach the source of the message. If you are the source, if you are the message creator, I'm not saying that our involvement becomes zero. We have a large role to play in terms of facilitating that. But if communication has to be effective, the meaning of the message should be ultimately shared by both the parties. It should be the sender and the receiver. And something that you have studied in your first semester itself when we are talking about communication theories and models, and why a certain model would work, and why feedback is such a necessary um, feature of the entire communication process. So the elitist top-down approach of communication source, the planner or the implementer. Now, who are the planners and the implementers? Those people who are in that space of planning or deciding, or those people who are implementing those developmental policies at the ground level, they are the ones. But if their approach is elitist, okay, I'm coming from this space, this is my understanding, and I know about the world because I've traveled the world. You might have traveled the world, but you might not have traveled into the interiors of Himachal Pradesh or Madhya Pradesh or Gujarat for that matter. Unless you actually spend time with the farmers in Vidarbha, you would not be able to empathize with them. Or unless you have read or extensively done research, or unless you know what are their practical problems at a ground level, your approach subconsciously by default will be top-down in nature. Understand that. So unless that is reversed, instead of participatory understanding is developed towards the problem and the ability of the client to solve it. Now, who is the client? The client are the stakeholders, the primary stakeholders, those people at the bottom rung of the society. So there, what is suggested that a participatory understanding instead of throwing an elitist approach to the communication process, the development process. So make it participatory. That might work. This will enhance not only mutual understanding, but interpersonal trust between the source and the receiver. Okay, that part is extremely crucial, right? Unless they buy that idea, unless there is a mutual trust and mutual understanding that, okay, this is what it is, this is what is offered to us. Now we need to see for ourselves whether this is working for us or not. So unless that is passed on to us, it will not work at the first place. For any kind of developmental, plan to work in any sector for that matter, doesn't really matter what sector it is. But if the idea is to develop, if the idea is to grow, then you have to keep in mind who the receiver is and how do we build up that sort of a mutual understanding. How do we develop that interpersonal trust? They need to have faith on us. They need to have faith on you. They need to believe that your idea would work. And you have to show them with equal mutual trust, respect, and love that we are considering what you're trying to say. So unless you try to understand what sort of indigenous knowledge they are trying to offer to us, unless you see how there could be a healthy marriage between the two, it would not work. You would end up offering something that might not work at the first place. Because your approach is coming from a Western model. Your approach is coming from a perspective which is alien to them. So understand what the needs of the clients are. Understand what they need in order to develop, not what you need to implement this. What has happened in the past, if you look at it, is we rushed into the entire development zone in order to make the country look extremely successful and developed. So there's always this partial image that was created in sort of a make-believe world where a majority of the population could be hogwashed for the next elections to buy into this idea that, okay, see, these are the things that we have done. Instead, what has happened is only the elite few could, or those people who actually had access to money or education, could understand and they could implement and they could stay aware and they gathered public opinion. And that's how the society has been running. But what about those people who are information poor? Unless that knowledge gap is taken off, unless there is an interpersonal trust between you as a creator and somebody else as a receiver, those implementations will not work. If communication is to be successful, the message should flow through the right channels of communication. Okay, this is also crucial. There is the channels which are within the domains of the participants, and more importantly, those which best serve the purpose of the communication. Now, what are the right channels of communication? So as a communication theorist or as a development strategist, you need to understand what are the right channels of communication and why they are important within the domain of the participants. So once you have a fair understanding of the participants, once you have done your research, thorough research and groundwork, looking at the nature of the participants or the communities or the geographies, all sort of scientific study has been done, then you can see whether that the kind of the channels of communication are right if only the participants have rightful access to it. Understand this part, that those channels are successful or those channels of communication are work or the messages passed on through those channels will only be successful if it is accessible to the participants at the ground level. So in that case, it would best serve the purpose of communication because the intended message would be designed that way. For example, educational TV programs may not serve any purpose when illiterate adults do not own or have access to this media. In that I have been reiterating for the longest period. That digital divide has to be cut down in the first place. Now somebody, for example, somebody who is deaf and dumb, if you deaf, dumb and blind, if you show them a television program and say that, okay, this is about spreading awareness regarding healthcare, what would they take out of it? Because their olfactory functions are not working. Somebody who cannot read and write and who has never gone to school and has no idea about literacy, so to say, what sort of programs you will try to design in the context, saying that, okay, but we did our best, we gave the best successful programs, but it didn't work. It would not work. It would not work because you are not considering that those people are illiterate adults. So unless you're considering those things, access, the gap, the lack of knowledge, how are you trying to force public opinion and how are you trying to build upon a democratic development process? It will not work, right? Ultimately, for any program to be successful, it has to be integrated and coordinated with the broader development needs of the people. What are the broader development needs of the people? When you go on to ask people at an individual level or at community level, most of the times what would happen is they would end up telling sorry stories, which concerns their own individual families. So when you gather information, when you talk to more families, increasingly travel to different parts of India or other parts. And I'm talking about the villages, I'm talking about reaching out to the urban poor, I'm talking about the places and the people who have lack of access to this sort of information. Keep in mind, once you have gathered all sort of information, you need to broaden the spectrum. You need to then look at what are the basic developmental needs that can be brought in as far as these people are concerned. It must also be implemented by committed leaders, people who value or who have a vision, people who understand what the needs of the communities are instead of just focusing on handful of people, which is what happens also, which leads to corruption, which leads to only have, um, which leads to people who are, you know, already upper caste, upper class, economically privileged, they having more access to, you know, technologies, implementation, every kind of things. So unless we have committed leaders, unless we have people who have a vision for communities or villages, um, it won't work. Given this overview of the role of communication in development, let's look at some specific developmental approach in the areas of agriculture, irrigation, health, family planning, literacy to see what obstacles are encountered in each area. Now, what we are going to do is, these are sectors. We are going to look at broader communicational barriers. It could be physical, it could be cultural, it could be economic. So largely placing these sectors, you know, within these three segments, you know, social barriers to development communication, cultural barriers to development communication, and economic barriers to development communication. We are going to look at um, these sort of sectors, whether it is the agricultural sector or the irrigation sector or health or family planning, and see how um, these barriers trickle down, or how these barriers play a larger role in stopping the development flow, so to say. So I'll stop here today, and in the next session we are going to look at the first one, which would be social barriers to communication.